On the edge of the town of Willow Creek, where the rolling plains met the thick, whispering woods, lived a man whose presence was as imposing as the land itself. Folks in town called him the giant rancher, not merely out of respect, but out of awe. At well over 6.5 feet, broad-shouldered, and solidly built from years of tending to cattle and mending fences, he was a figure both admired and feared. His name was Thomas Hawley, though few had ever spoken it aloud outside of necessity. He was the kind of man whose shadow seemed to fill a room before he even entered, whose hands could lift the heaviest gate with ease, and whose voice could calm a stampede of frightened horses without a single raised tone dot despite his formidable size and strength. Thomas was not one to seek attention. He lived alone on a sprawling ranch that had been in his family for generations. The land itself seemed to recognize him as its steward. The fields were immaculate, the barns solid and well-maintained, and the livestock healthy and content. Every morning he would rise before the sun, his routine etched into muscle memory, checking fences, inspecting the water troughs, feeding the cattle, and making sure every horse had fresh hay. It was a quiet life, shaped by diligence, patience, and an unspoken understanding of nature's rhythms. Those who knew him described Thomas as a man of few words, but those words carried weight. He had an uncanny ability to read people, to know when someone was hiding fear or despair behind a polite smile. Children, initially intimidated by his towering figure, soon learned to trust him. He had a gentle touch despite his enormous hands, capable of lifting a struggling calf or soothing a crying child with equal tenderness. Animals seemed to sense this too. Horses would nuzzle him without hesitation, and cattle would follow him across the pastures as if he were leading them through some unspoken promise of safety. Yet for all his strength and competence, Thomas bore a subtle loneliness. The town was small, and while neighbors would exchange greetings or assist with occasional emergencies, they didn't know him deeply. Friends were scarce, and family ties had long since thinned. His life was tied to the land, to the rhythms of ranching, and to the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. He liked it that way. Solitude, he believed, sharpened his senses, made him vigilant, and kept him close to the world he had vowed to protect. It was during these hours of solitude that Thomas often felt a strange duality in his existence. On one hand, the open plains offered freedom space to think, to wander, to breathe. On the other, it bore a hint of unease, a whisper of vulnerability. He had seen the outskirts of town grow lawless in small ways, abandoned buildings, fleeting, rumors of crime, the occasional act of cruelty. These were things he noted quietly but did not dwell upon. He trusted in his ability to confront danger when it came, but he also knew the world could shift faster than even the tallest fences could hold. On this particular morning, Thomas awoke to the familiar scent of dew-soaked grass and the faint tang of smoke from the nearby forest where controlled burns kept wildfires at bay. He moved deliberately, boots crunching against the frost-covered earth, lantern in hand as he walked to check the stables. Each horse greeted him with a low nicker, as though acknowledging the protector who had watched over them for years. He felt the weight of responsibility keenly. His ranch was more than property. It was a living, breathing ecosystem, delicate, yet resilient, demanding constant attention and respect. By mid-morning, Thomas had already completed most of his chores. He paused for a moment on the porch of his modest, weathered house, gazing at the horizon where the railway tracks cut across the plains. The tracks were old, long forgotten by most travelers, but they had been a lifeline for the town in its earlier days. Thomas often found himself staring in that direction, contemplating the strange parallel between the rail's rigid, unyielding, yet carrying countless stories and his own life. His thoughts, usually steady and practical, sometimes wandered to what lay beyond his familiar terrain, the unknown, the unexpected, the unpredictable. Little did he know, that very day, the quiet rhythm of his life was about to be shattered. A scream, raw and desperate, would soon pierce the calm morning air, and the giant rancher, vigilant and unafraid, would answer it. As the sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills, the vast plains of Thomas Hale's ranch took on a golden glow, each blade of grass and swaying stalk of wheat illuminated like molten metal. The world seemed to hold its breath in that tranquil moment, the way it does just before twilight. Thomas moved methodically across the land, ensuring the last of the cattle were settled for the night. He carried a bucket of feed in one hand, his massive frame casting a long, stretching shadow that merged with the shadows of the fence posts. The air was cool but not biting, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers mingled with the earthy aroma of churned soil. Evening was Thomas's favorite time of day. The sun's warmth lingered, softening the harshness of labor, while the approaching night promised rest and quiet reflection. He had no use for idle chatter, no need for the town's gossip or the clamor of social gatherings. On his ranch, he was accountable only to the land, the animals, and himself. It was in these hours, when the world seemed to slow down, that he felt most at peace. The horses were content, pawing gently at the ground, ears swiveling toward Thomas as he moved among them. The cows had gathered near the water trough, heads low as they drank, their breathing slow and steady. Even the dogs, loyal and alert, lay in the long grass, eyes half closed, sensing the calm that enveloped the ranch. Thomas paused for a moment by the fence line, surveying the fields. The railway tracks lay beyond the pasture, their steel rails glinting faintly in the dying light. It was rare for him to see trains here now. The old line had fallen into infrequent use, carrying only occasional freight across the quiet plains. He hummed softly to himself, a low, almost imperceptible tune that seemed to blend with the whisper of the evening breeze. The day's work had been demanding but satisfying, each fence mended, each animal accounted for. Life on the ranch was predictable in its labor, yet unpredictable in its nuances. One could never take the wind, the weather, or the temperament of a horse for granted. Thomas appreciated these small uncertainties. They reminded him that he was alive, that the land required respect, and that vigilance was always necessary. As shadows lengthened, he walked to the barn to check the gates, his boots echoing softly against the wooden floorboards. The horses nickered again, and he paused to scratch behind the ears of a young mare, feeling the warmth of her body beneath his hands. Even in solitude, these interactions grounded him, connecting him to life beyond mere survival. He spoke quietly to her, words he had likely repeated hundreds of times before, but they carried a rhythm that was comforting, almost ritualistic. The sky above shifted, painting itself in hues of orange, purple, and fading blue. Birds returned to their nests, chirping softly as they settled in for the night. Thomas took a slow breath, the kind that carries both exhaustion and contentment, and leaned against the fence post for a moment. The land was calm. Everything was as it should be. But beneath the calm, there was a subtle tension. Even the quietest evenings on the ranch carried a hint of vulnerability. The wind through the tall grass could mask danger, a shadow could hide a threat, and the tracks beyond the pasture, seemingly inert, could carry more than mere trains. Thomas had learned to trust these instincts, honed over decades of solitude and responsibility. Though he cherished these peaceful moments, he remained alert, ears straining for anything out of place, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. As darkness deepened, a soft rustling came from the far side of the railway tracks. Thomas paused, listening intently. At first, he dismissed it as the usual sounds of wildlife settling for the night. Yet something in the cadence of the sound, a stifled cry, fleeting but distinct, stirred a deep primal awareness within him. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the source. The golden glow of dusk was giving way to shadow, yet even in the growing darkness, the rancher's instincts told him that this was no ordinary sound of the evening dot. For the first time that day, the serene rhythm of his life faltered. A scream, sharp and desperate, sliced through the calm. Thomas's muscles tensed, his breath steadying. The peaceful evening, the soft glow of twilight, the comforting routine of his work, all of it was suddenly overshadowed by the urgency. In that cry, without hesitation, he swung the gate open and moved toward the railway tracks, each step deliberate, heavy with purpose. The calm evening was ending, and the night was about to reveal a danger unlike any he had faced before. The first scream came faint, almost swallowed by the rustle of the evening wind through the tall grass. At first, Thomas thought it might be an animal, a coyote perhaps, caught in the underbrush. But something about it was wrong the pitch. The desperation, the unmistakable human fear laced within it. His heart thudded, not with panic, but with a sharp surge of alertness. He had heard enough in his ears to know when a sound demanded attention, and this one did. Thomas paused mid-step, the fading light casting long shadows over the plains. The railway tracks were a short distance beyond the edge of his pasture, glinting faintly as the sun dipped lower. Normally, the tracks were silent, abandoned most of the time, only occasionally humming under the weight of a distant train. Tonight, however, they seemed to hold something different, a tension that was almost palpable. The scream had come from that direction, slicing across the open fields, vibrating against his chest with urgency. He squinted into the gathering darkness, his eyes scanning the area. The tracks cut a straight line through the land, cold steel against the soft curves of the plains. Beyond them, the shadowed embankments and the thickets of trees created pockets of darkness where anything or anyone could hide. Thomas's instincts, honed from years of solitude and responsibility, told him that the danger was real. Without hesitation, he grabbed the lantern from the porch, its handle heavy in his massive hand, and strode toward the sound. His boots sank slightly into the soft earth, leaving deep impressions as he crossed the pasture. The animals stirred nervously, sensing something was amiss. The horses lifted their heads, ears pricked, but none attempted to bolt. They trusted him to know what to do. The scream came again, louder this time, closer. Thomas's pulse remained steady, his breath controlled. He had faced storms, stampedes, and the occasional rustler, but nothing had prepared him for the raw, primal fear that clung to this cry. It carried urgency and vulnerability that demanded immediate action. He moved faster, the lantern casting a warm circle of light that danced across the grass and fence posts, revealing the familiar lines of his ranch in stark relief against the growing darkness. As he neared the railway tracks, a chill ran through him. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of iron and damp earth and the faint tang of smoke from the distant forest. The scream came again, now accompanied by whimpers and muffled sounds that tugged at his conscience. He could feel it. Before he even saw it, someone was in immediate danger. Thomas approached the tracks cautiously, his enormous frame blending into the shadows. The rails stretched ahead, silent and menacing, and he noticed signs of a struggle, footprints in the dirt, torn fabric caught on the jagged edges of the embankment. His mind worked quickly, mapping the scene, anticipating where he might find the source of the sound. Every instinct, every sense he had developed over decades, screamed at him to hurry. Then, in a small clearing near the tracks, illuminated faintly by the lantern's glow, he saw them. A young woman, her clothes torn and dirt-streaked, struggled against the ropes that bound her wrists and ankles. Beside her, a tiny newborn cried weakly, its small body trembling with fear and cold. The cords tying them to the railway ties were thick, cruel, and unforgiving, cutting faintly into the woman's skin. The sight struck Thomas with a jolt of anger and disbelief. For a moment, he simply stared, assessing the situation. The woman's eyes met his wide with terror and disbelief. It was as if she could not comprehend that someone had come to her aid so quickly. Thomas felt a surge of protective instinct. Without thinking, he knelt, his enormous hands careful yet precise, and began untying the ropes. The newborn's cries grew louder, almost synchronized with the frantic beating of the woman's heart. Time seemed to stretch. The wind whispered through the plains, carrying with it the faint echo of the danger that had brought them here. Thomas's focus narrowed entirely on the woman and child, on removing them from the immediate threat. Every second counted. As the last knot gave way, he lifted the newborn gently, tucking it safely against his chest, while helping the woman to her feet. She leaned against him, exhausted, trembling, yet alive. The screams had faded into the night, replaced now by a tense silence, broken only by the newborn's soft wails and the distant cry of an owl. Thomas Hawley, the giant rancher, had answered the call. And in that instant, the quiet life he had built on the plains changed forever. Thomas stood for a moment, lantern held high, letting his eyes sweep the area around the railway tracks. The woman clung to him weakly, her newborn still nestled against his chest, eyes half shut from exhaustion and terror. He could feel the tremor in her body, a mix of cold, fear, and relief, and it spurred him to act faster. But before moving them any farther, he needed to understand what had happened and whether the danger was truly gone. The tracks stretched in either direction, like twin lines of steel disappearing into the darkening horizon. Thomas's eyes darted along their length. The embankments and thickets offered easy cover for anyone lying in wait. He scanned the shadows carefully, taking note of footprints, scuffed dirt, and broken twigs. The ground bore evidence of a struggle. Dirt kicked up, torn scraps of fabric snagged on branches, a boot print pressed deep into the soft soil. The scene suggested haste and violence. Someone had abandoned them here intentionally, or perhaps had been interrupted. The woman whispered something, her voice hoarse. Thomas knelt slightly to hear her better, adjusting the newborn so the child's warmth pressed against his chest. They left us here," she said, shivering. "I don't know why. I don't know if they're coming back." Her words were fragmented, punctuated by gasps for breath. The fear in her voice matched the scene, desperate, raw, and uncertain. Thomas's mind worked quickly, mapping possibilities. Whoever had tied her to the tracks had wanted her or the child hurt. But the fact that they had left or had fled so suddenly suggested interruption. Perhaps someone had approached, perhaps the train's distant whistle had startled them, or perhaps luck had simply intervened. In any case, he needed to ensure they were safe before moving further. He crouched and examined the ropes more closely, noting the coarse texture and the way they had been tied around the woman's wrists and ankles. They were rough, strong, and intended to restrain, not merely to inconvenience. He mentally cataloged the knots, recognizing a hurried, unskilled binding. Whoever had done this was panicked, possibly inexperienced, and unlikely to return soon, but that did not make the threat negligible. Thomas rose slowly, lantern casting elongated shadows across the tracks and the embankment. He took in the surrounding. Brush, the twisted undergrowth, and the shallow trenches carved by runoff water. Any of these could conceal an assailant, and he could not allow complacency to dull his senses. The land, usually a source of peace, now seemed to pulse with hidden menace. The evening's calm was gone, replaced by tension and the need for vigilance. He turned back to the woman. "We need to get somewhere safe," he said, his voice low but firm. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly, gripping his arm for support. Thomas adjusted his hold on the newborn, balancing the child against his broad chest, and led them a few steps away from the tracks. Every footfall was deliberate, scanning, listening. His senses, honed over years of solitary ranch work, picked up every rustle, every faint shift of wind through the grass. Every distant animal cried out as they moved. Thomas considered the nearest shelter. His house was too far to reach safely in a hurry. The barn, sturdy and close, would offer immediate protection. Its heavy doors and enclosed interior could keep the woman and child safe while he assessed the situation further. He guided them. "There, careful not to jostle the baby, careful not to alarm the woman." Once inside, he set the newborn gently on a soft blanket in the corner of the barn. The woman sank onto a hay bale, her breathing still ragged, but slowly beginning to regain control. Thomas surveyed the barn, noting the tools and supplies he could use to fortify the space if necessary, as well as the exits and vantage points. He knew the area well, and he would use every advantage to protect them. Finally, Thomas allowed himself a brief moment to consider the implications. Whoever had done this, whoever had left a woman and her newborn bound to the tracks, was dangerous, reckless, and unpredictable. And they had been bold enough to target someone in broad daylight, near a location that was, until now, quiet and rarely traveled. He would need help, but he also knew that immediate action depended on him. Waiting or hesitating could be fatal. The rancher took a deep breath, his massive hands resting on his knees. The evening, once calm and routine, had become the beginning of something far more serious. Danger had arrived in their lives unbidden and cruel, and Thomas Hawley, the giant rancher, was already preparing to confront it. Once the woman and her newborn were settled safely inside the barn, Thomas took a moment to steady himself. The lantern cast warm, flickering light across the hay-strewn interior, illuminating the tension etched on both their faces. The baby had quieted somewhat, nestled against a soft blanket, but the woman's eyes remained wide and haunted, darting toward the barn doors and the shadows beyond. She whispered something unintelligible, then shook her head as if trying to rid herself of the memory. Thomas knew that to protect them, he needed to understand the full extent of the danger. He stepped back outside, lantern raised, ears straining. The stillness of the plains that evening now felt oppressive, almost unnatural. The faint wind through the grass sounded like whispers, the rails of the railway track gleaming coldly under the moonlight. He needed to examine exactly where they had been tied, and perhaps, if he was careful in cover, who had left them in such a state. Crossing the few yards to the tracks, he scanned the ground with practiced attention. That's when he noticed it. Faint drag marks leading toward the far side of the tracks, partially obscured by dirt and scattered leaves. The marks were uneven, suggesting a hurried movement, but they clearly indicated that someone or some people had moved through here recently. Thomas followed them carefully, tracing their path along the embankment. Then came the sight that made his chest tighten, a small bundle of torn clothing snagged on a bush. The fabric was damp, streaked with mud, and smelled faintly of smoke and iron. He bent to examine it, his massive hands careful not to disturb potential clues. Inside the fabric, he discovered a discarded handbag, partially open. Its contents spilled across the ground: a wallet, a locket, a crumpled piece of paper, with a hastily scrawled note. The note was brief, almost illegible, but the words that were clear sent a shiver through him. "Do not follow. She is ours." The message confirmed his worst fears. Whoever had done this was organized enough to leave a warning and bold enough to act brazenly. And now they had abandoned the woman and newborn, perhaps assuming she was incapacitated or that no one would come to her aid. Thomas's mind raced as he pieced together the evidence. The rough rope, the hurried knots, the drag marks, the discarded items, they painted a picture of calculated cruelty, not random malice. He looked back toward the barn, where the woman had begun to calm slightly. He could see the fear in her eyes, still raw and undeniable, and he felt a surge of protective instinct. He knew that danger had not vanished. It had only retreated for now. Whoever had left them tied to the tracks could return, or worse, they could be watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike again. Thomas knelt by the tracks once more, examining the marks and the surrounding area. A set of footprints led away from the drag marks, partially washed out by the evening wind, but enough remained to indicate two individuals, moving quickly and deliberately into the darkness. He could estimate their height, approximate weight, and direction of travel. His years on the ranch had trained him to read the land like a map, and every subtle clue added to the story. A sudden sound of twigs snapping somewhere down the tracks made him tense instantly. His hand went to the lantern, raising its light toward the direction of the noise. Nothing moved visibly, but the quiet was suddenly deafening. Every instinct he had screamed vigilance. He realized with a weighty certainty that this was not an isolated act. The woman and her child were only the first victims, or perhaps they had been specifically targeted for reasons unknown to him. He returned to the barn, his mind set. The woman looked at him as he entered, uncertainty written on her face. They might come back, she whispered. Thomas knelt, meeting her eyes. "We'll be ready," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I won't let them hurt you." In that moment, the gravity of the situation hit fully. This was no ordinary crime. It was calculated, cruel, and dangerous. And Thomas Hawley, the giant rancher, was now caught in the center of it. He had rescued them, yes, but the real challenge, the confrontation with the people who had done this, was only beginning. The peaceful plains of his ranch, once a sanctuary, were now a stage for something far darker than he had ever faced. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the barn, and Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. Who had done this, why, and how he could protect the woman and her newborn while uncovering the truth. Outside, the night deepened, carrying with it the faint echo of unseen threats and the promise of reckoning. Inside the dim light of the barn, Thomas Hawley sat on a rough wooden crate, the newborn now sleeping safely in the crook of his massive arm. The woman, still trembling, had wrapped herself in a spare blanket, her eyes darting to every shadow as if expecting the danger to appear at any moment. Thomas studied her silently for a moment, measuring her strength, her fear, and her trust in him. Then he turned his attention outward, toward the night and the silent railway tracks. The evidence he had discovered, drag marks, footprints, torn fabric, and the threatening note told him that the people behind this were methodical, deliberate, and dangerous. They had made a mistake leaving the woman alive, but that didn't mean they wouldn't return. If they had planned to harm her, they could do so again. Thomas's first priority was clear: keep her and the baby safe. His second was to identify who had done this, and why did he pace the barn floor, thinking aloud as he did so. "They're desperate, or desperate to make a point," he muttered. "Either way, they won't stop just because we're here. We need a plan and exit strategy, safe spots, and a way to defend ourselves if they come back." The barn offered some advantages: sturdy doors that could be barricaded, thick wooden beams for cover, and hay bales that could serve as both concealment and makeshift seating. But it was still vulnerable if attackers were determined. He needed to use the landscape to his advantage: the long lines of the railway track, the embankments, the brush, and the open plains. Anyone approaching would be visible from a distance. If he positioned himself correctly, Thomas moved outside to the edge of the barn, lantern raised, eyes scanning the horizon. The moon was high enough to cast long shadows, but not so bright as to reveal every detail. He marked several spots around the barn where he could station himself or use natural cover. Each position offered lines of sight down the tracks and across the field. He could predict the angles of approach, the likely hiding places, and the timing if anyone returned. Returning to the barn, Thomas knelt beside the woman. "We're going to stay here tonight," he said firmly, "and we're not leaving until the sun rises. I'll be outside, keeping watch. If anyone comes near, we'll know. You and the baby stay inside." Her lips trembled as she nodded, her body racked with residual fear. Thomas handed her a small flask of water and a few pieces of bread he had grabbed earlier. "Eat something," he said gently. "You need strength." Next, he thought about communication and support. He had neighbors and friends who trusted him and who could be called upon if needed. The nearest town had a small sheriff's office, but response times were slow in these parts. He needed to prepare for self-reliance first and call for help only when absolutely necessary. He also considered improvised weapons, farm tools, lanterns, even sturdy pieces of wood. The barn could become a temporary fortress if required. Finally, Thomas outlined a strategy in his mind. First, observe the tracks carefully at intervals to look for any sign of return. Second, remain mobile. Never be in one place too long if someone approaches. Third, gather information. Every footprint, every broken branch, every discarded item could reveal the assailant's identity or intentions. And fourth, protect the woman and her child above all else. As he finished thinking through the plan, the night grew quieter, almost unnaturally so. The baby stirred slightly, and the woman sighed in relief as she watched Thomas settle near the barn doors, lantern in hand. He adjusted his position, leaning against a wooden beam, his massive frame both a comfort and a warning. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This was no longer a simple rescue. It was a defensive operation, a stack-out, and the first step toward justice. But Thomas Holly, the giant rancher, had faced storms, fires, and wild animals. He understood the land, the people, and how to think several steps ahead. And now, he would use every ounce of that experience to protect the innocent and confront those who sought to do harm. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying faint echoes from the direction of the railway tracks. Thomas tightened his grip on the lantern, his mind alert, ready for whatever the night would bring. The first move had been made. Now the next move and the real challenge awaited. The night deepened into a velvet black, with only the lantern's warm glow marking Thomas's position near the barn doors. His ears strained for the slightest sound: footsteps, rustling leaves, anything that indicated movement near the railway tracks. The woman sat behind him, clutching the baby to her chest, eyes wide with fear but trusting him completely. Thomas had positioned himself strategically, using the barn's beams for cover and casting his lantern light along the paths of approach he had identified earlier. Hours passed in tense silence. The occasional hoot of an owl or the distant cry of a coyote heightened the sense of isolation but also served as reassurance. No humans were moving nearby yet. Thomas shifted slightly, scanning the perimeter again. Then, faintly at first, he heard a soft, dragging sound coming from the direction of the tracks. His instincts kicked in immediately. He raised the lantern slowly, revealing two figures crouched low, moving cautiously toward the barn. Their movements were deliberate but uneven, betraying both caution and urgency. Thomas's hand went to a heavy iron rod leaning against the wall, gripping it tightly. He could see their silhouettes clearly, now tall, shadowy, and dangerous looking, with the faint glint of knives or tools in their hands. "Stay behind me," Thomas whispered to the woman. She nodded, pressing the baby closer to her chest. Thomas adjusted his stance, making himself appear even larger in the lantern light. He knew intimidation could be as effective as brute force. The two figures hesitated as they reached the barn's perimeter. One of them spoke in a low, threatening voice. "We know she's here. Come out, and it'll be easier on you." The words carried a mix of menace and warning. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He studied their approach, noticing the tension in their shoulders, the uneven steps that suggested inexperience, and the fact that they were overconfident in thinking they could surprise him. Suddenly, the taller of the two lunged toward the barn door, testing it. Thomas reacted instinctively, swinging the iron rod and striking the side of the barn near the intruder. The loud metallic thud echoed across the empty plains. Startled, the assailants recoiled, giving Thomas the opportunity to step forward, his voice booming, "You won't touch her. Not tonight." The smaller figure made a desperate lunge, knife raised. Thomas sidestepped with surprising speed for his massive frame and brought the rod down decisively, forcing the attacker backward. The taller man recovered, shouting, and tried to circle around to the other side of the barn, but Thomas anticipated the move, adjusting his stance to block the escape. The struggle was brief but intense, a test of raw strength, timing, and cunning. Thomas's years on the ranch, handling wild animals and heavy machinery, gave him the edge. With a powerful sweep of the rod, he disarmed the taller intruder, sending the knife clattering across the barn floor. Both assailants froze, realizing they were outmatched. Their initial confidence evaporating. Thomas advanced slowly, keeping the rod raised, eyes locked on the intruders. "Leave now," he warned, his deep voice resonating with authority. "And never come near her again." The two men exchanged a glance, fear overtaking aggression. Without another word, they fled into the darkness, retreating toward the tracks from which they had come, disappearing into the shadows. Breathing heavily, Thomas lowered the rod and turned to the woman. She clutched the baby tightly, tears streaming down her face, a mix of relief, fear, and gratitude. Thomas nodded reassuringly. "They're gone. For now, you're safe." He knew, however, that this was only the beginning. These men had not come alone. There was likely a larger plan at work, and more dangers could emerge. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving a tense exhaustion in its wake. Thomas helped the woman sit comfortably, covering the baby with an extra blanket. His mind raced, thinking about next steps, alerting the authorities, tracing the origin of these attackers, and preparing for the possibility that they might return with reinforcements. For the first time that night, the woman allowed herself to breathe fully, feeling the safety of the barn and the protective presence of Thomas Hawley. Yet, the railway tracks outside remained a silent reminder that danger was never far away. The first confrontation had been won, but the battle was far from over. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting pale gold light across the barn and the surrounding plains. The first confrontation had ended, but Thomas Hawley knew the danger had not vanished. It had merely retreated into the shadows. After ensuring the woman and her newborn were comfortable and had a small breakfast, Thomas set out to uncover why anyone would go to such lengths to harm them. He returned to the railway tracks, retracing the previous night's clues with a sharper eye. The drag marks, footprints, and discarded handbag were still there, and he examined them carefully, piecing together patterns that could reveal the attacker's identity. The handwritten note, with its cryptic warning, lingered in his mind. "Do not follow. She is ours." Someone had deliberately targeted this woman and child, and Thomas was determined to find out who and why. Back at the barn, he spread out the contents of the handbag on a wooden table. There was a wallet, several personal documents, and a locket. containing a photograph of a young man, her husband, presumably. Among the papers, one caught his attention. A letter, partially torn, written in hurried, almost frantic script. The letter suggested that the woman possessed information or property of great value to someone else, though its exact contents were obscured. Thomas frowned. This was no random act of cruelty. It was calculated, deliberate, and motivated by gain or revenge. Thomas decided the next step was to speak with the woman, gently coaxing information from her while keeping her comfort and trust in mind. "We need to understand why they targeted you," he said softly, sitting across from her. She hesitated, glancing down at the baby before speaking. Slowly, she revealed that her late father had been a wealthy landowner with a contested estate. Certain powerful individuals had been pressuring her family to hand over property and resources, resorting to intimidation when negotiations failed. She feared that someone had escalated matters, deciding that threatening her and the child would force her compliance. The pieces began to align in Thomas's mind. The attackers were not random criminals. They were agents of someone seeking leverage, possibly tied to the inheritance or the family's remaining assets. They had underestimated the woman's resilience, not realizing that she had courage and resourcefulness of her own. Thomas's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. These men were likely to return, perhaps with reinforcements, and they would be bolder if they thought the family was vulnerable. He spent the rest of the morning carefully documenting evidence, footprints, drag marks, and the contents of the handbag. He made a mental map of the surrounding area, noting strategic vantage points and potential escape routes. Every detail mattered. Thomas understood that uncovering the motive was only half the battle. He needed to anticipate the attackers. Next move to protect the woman and child effectively. By midday, Thomas had developed a clearer picture of the situation. The attackers' motive was financial and coercive. They were acting on orders, not out of personal vendetta. Knowing this allowed him to anticipate their strategy. They would likely attempt another confrontation, aiming to intimidate rather than directly kill unless provoked. Thomas made a list of contingencies: safe places for the woman to hide, ways to block access to the barn, and methods to signal for help discreetly if necessary. Returning to the barn, Thomas shared his findings with the woman, careful to maintain calm in his voice. "They're after something specific," he explained. "It's not random, but now we know what we're dealing with, we can prepare. You and the baby will be safe, and we can confront this with strategy rather than fear." Relief washed over her face, though worry lingered. She had endured terror, but the clarity Thomas provided gave her a renewed sense of control. As evening approached, Thomas continued his preparations. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the railway tracks and the surrounding fields. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The woman and her newborn depended entirely on his strength, vigilance, and cunning. He knew that uncovering the motive was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead in ensuring that the next confrontation ended decisively in their favor. Outside, the plains were silent, but the tension hung in the air like an unseen storm. The first clues had been pieced together, the motive revealed, and a plan was forming. Thomas Hawley, the giant rancher, stood ready not only as protector but as strategist, preparing to face the forces that sought to terrorize the innocent. The stage was set for the next encounter, one that would test courage, wits, and resolve. Night fell again over the plains, and Thomas Hale's barn was bathed in the silver glow of the moon. The first confrontation had given him a glimpse of the attackers' methods and boldness, and the morning's investigation had revealed their motive. Now it was time to act proactively. Thomas knew he could not wait for them to strike again. He needed to turn the tables and set a trap. Inside the barn, he moved quietly, arranging hay bales to create narrow lanes and choke points. He positioned sturdy farm tools and boards at angles that could act as barricades or distractions. The lanterns were dimmed to prevent the attackers from seeing inside while allowing him to see out. Every corner was considered, every shadow a potential hiding spot. Thomas's mind worked like a chessboard, predicting the attackers' likely movements and reactions. He then focused on the tracks. A few miles east, a narrow clearing in the embankment offered perfect vantage for observation and interception. Thomas marked it mentally as the best spot to lure the attackers, using the barn as bait. He knew their greed would push them to act recklessly. They wanted the woman and the baby, and they believed the barn was an easy target to strengthen the trap. Thomas created subtle distractions. A few small rocks were positioned near the tracks to make noise if stepped on. He placed reflective metal scraps to catch the moonlight and mislead the intruder's perception of movement. Every detail was designed to slow, confuse, and intimidate them when they arrived. Meanwhile, he spoke to the woman in calm, reassuring tones. "You stay here," he instructed, covering the baby. "Do exactly as I say. You're safe if you follow the plan. Nothing will reach you. I'll handle the rest." Her nod was tense but resolute. Trust was all she had, and she placed it fully in Thomas's capable hands. Hours passed in quiet vigilance. Thomas rotated his position outside the barn, watching the tracks and listening for the faintest hint of movement. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and metal rails, masking his own presence. Finally, after long minutes of silence, a shadow appeared on the tracks, tall and cautious, moving exactly as Thomas had anticipated. He waited, counting his breaths, and then moved to intercept, using the clearing as planned. The attackers hesitated as they noticed subtle signs of ambush, the rocks, the glint of metal, the seemingly empty terrain. Panic set in quickly. They realized they were being watched and outmaneuvered. Thomas, with his immense presence and strategic positioning, pressed forward, forcing them into a narrow path where escape was limited. The trap worked perfectly. One attacker stumbled over the rocks, giving Thomas the chance to block his advance. The other tried to flank him, but Thomas had predicted this move, cutting him off and forcing him into a corner. With a swift and precise strike, he disarmed the taller assailant and immobilized the other. Both men were panting, their earlier confidence completely shattered. Thomas's deep, commanding voice rang across the clearing. "This ends tonight. You won't harm her or the baby. Leave the area and never return." The attackers, defeated not just physically but psychologically, scrambled toward the tracks and fled into the night, leaving behind weapons and their earlier arrogance. After the adrenaline subsided, Thomas returned to the barn, carrying the items recovered from the attackers. The woman and her child were safe, and for the first time, a sense of calm settled over the barn. The trap had not only neutralized the immediate threat, but also sent a warning to anyone else who might consider following the same path. Thomas knew, however, that this was not the final chapter. The attackers had motives beyond simple intimidation. There was still the question of who had ordered them and why. But for now, the immediate danger was over. The woman and her newborn were safe, and Thomas Hawley had turned the night into a triumph of courage, strategy, and sheer determination. The first light of dawn broke across the plains, casting soft gold and pink hues over the barn and railway tracks. The night's danger had passed, but the weight of what had occurred lingered in the crisp morning air. Thomas Hawley sat outside, the woman and her newborn nearby, safe and finally able to breathe freely. The adrenaline from the trap had faded, replaced by a calm resolve. Justice had to follow. Thomas had contacted the local authorities discreetly the night before. providing them with detailed descriptions of the attackers, their discarded weapons, and all the evidence collected at the barn and tracks. By now, officers were already moving to apprehend the fleeing men. Thomas knew law enforcement would handle the legal repercussions, but he understood that the psychological and strategic aftermath required careful attention. The woman, now sitting in the soft sunlight, held her baby close, tears of relief and gratitude glistening in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice trembling. "You saved us. You saved my baby." Thomas shook his head with a gentle smile. "No thanks needed. You trusted yourself to survive, and I just helped guide the way. That's all." With the immediate threat neutralized, Thomas turned his focus to uncovering the source of the attacks. The letter and the woman's family history pointed to a shadowy figure, from her father's past someone who had coveted the estate and was willing to employ intimidation and violence to achieve it. Thomas accompanied the woman to meet a trusted family lawyer who helped identify the mastermind behind the plot, a distant relative who had hoped to manipulate legal loopholes and had sent the attackers to ensure compliance. When authorities arrested the culprits, the mastermind's involvement was revealed and justice began to take its formal course. The attackers faced criminal charges, and the relative was exposed for attempting coercion and fraud. The woman's family assets were secured, with legal protection in place to prevent any future schemes. The sense of closure brought a quiet triumph, but it also underscored the danger of greed and how far some would go to claim what wasn't theirs. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The woman and her child stayed at Thomas's ranch for a few more days, healing from the shock and terror of recent events. Thomas resumed his daily routines, tending to the land, the livestock, and the practicalities of ranch life, but the experience had changed him. He had always known the value of vigilance, courage, and strength, but now he had applied them in a way that saved innocent lives and thwarted deliberate malice. In time, the woman and her newborn returned to their family estate, fortified with the knowledge that they were no longer vulnerable. Letters and updates arrived occasionally, sharing stories of recovery, growth, and gratitude. Thomas Hawley, the giant rancher, remained on his land, vigilant but content, knowing that he had made a difference beyond the physical strength that defined him through courage, strategy, and unwavering moral resolve. The railway tracks, once a scene of terror, were now quiet, stretching into the horizon as a silent reminder of the night when courage faced greed head-on. And though danger could return in some form, Thomas had shown that vigilance, foresight, and heart could confront darkness and prevail. The sun climbed higher, bathing the barn and surrounding plains in golden light. Life continued, peaceful, but aware, and Thomas Hawley stood tall, a guardian not just of the land, but of justice, safety, and hope.